Hello team, welcome to my session on Coffee with Prab, and today we're going to discuss about Crisc exam cram summary domain 2, which is called as a IT risk assessment. Domain 2 represent 20% of the Crisc examination and approx 30 to 31 question we can test from the domain 2. Make sure you should give proper attention to domain 2 while you're preparing for this exam. I'm going to share some important pointers which is required for you to understand from the exam point of view. If you're new to my channel, do subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to make sure you should not miss my future videos. I made similar videos of domain 1 and introduction of a series you can check in my description box. My name is Prab Nair. For more information, you can refer my LinkedIn profile. So without wasting a time, let's start with the first part. So domain 2 is basically split into two content, part A and part B. If you talk about the part A, which is called as a IT risk identification, in which we're going to discuss about risk events, very important for the exam, threat modeling, vulnerability and control deficiency analysis, and risk scenario development. So when you're preparing for series, make sure you should give proper attention to risk scenario development. What is risk scenario development? What are the methods of a risk scenario development? And what are the type of risk events we have? And on the part B, we're going to discuss about the IT risk analysis, evaluation and assessment, where you need to understand the different type of framework, risk register. It is very important for you to know the usage of the risk register. When to use risk register? What is the purpose of risk register? What is risk register? Along with that, you also need to know the different type of risk analysis like qualitative, quantitative, semi-quantitative or semi-qualitative. So this kind of a risk analysis method you need to understand. And you also need to understand in which condition we use the qualitative and quantitative and their advantage and disadvantage. Along with that, in domain 2, we also talk about the BIA, business impact analysis, which talk about what need to be recovered and how quickly I can recover. Because based on the BIA only, we try to prioritize the recovery strategy. You also need to understand the thin line difference between the risk assessment versus BIA. Last but not the least, very good understanding is required on inherent, residual and current risk. In which condition we called inherent, in which condition we called residual, in which condition we called as a current risk. So that is testable in the exam. So let's start with the first part, which is called part A, IT risk identification. Okay, so first part, which is called part A, is IT risk identification. What I noticed, ISACA, when they introduce a new version of CISA, now CISM, CRIS, they basically organize the content in a form of part 1 and part B. So same in domain 1 also we have a part A and part B, in domain B also have a part A and part B. So in the part A, we're talking about IT risk identification. So let's discuss what are the parameters, what are the content we have in the IT risk identification. Okay, so before going to understand what is risk event, we have some basics, okay, that we need to understand. Example like this is my server and this server is basically generating a value for the organization. Okay, so we have a server with generating a value for the organization. So for me, this server and their associate data is the asset. Okay, now we have a hacker. Okay, hacker discovered a weakness in the server like weak password, okay, unpatched system. Okay, so we discovered some kind of a weakness which is also called as a vulnerability in the system. So vulnerability is nothing, it is just like a weakness. Okay, so asset, we're generating a value. Vulnerability is called as a weakness. And third thing is basically called as a threat. Threat is an action. So here the hacker is basically performing an action by exploiting a vulnerability and gain access to the server. Now what happened? There is a disclosure of data or server is basically down or server is unavailable. So this is basically the impact we have on the organization. Okay, So it is very important for you to know the risk event and threat event. So risk event are those discrete specific occurrence that result in an impact upon the enterprise. Okay, that is why risk is always measured by the likelihood and impact. Likelihood is basically all about chance of occurring. Example, hacker able to exploit the server. So what is the chance of that? And if it happen, what is the impact? Okay, whereas a threat event describe the series of action that may take place. Okay, that is called as a threat event. However, on their own, they do not consider or include likelihood of occurrence or impact. It is just an action. So risk is basically some risk event is a sum of likelihood and impact, and threat is all about the likelihood of an action. So some common example of the risk event, I can say that, okay, new regulations that impose a new requirement on the enterprise, loss of data, loss of key people. So this is basically the overall impact we have. But along with that, we also need to understand what are the different factors we have which increase the risk for the organization. So risk factor influence the frequency or business or mission impact on the risk scenario, and risk factor can be of a different type. So here the risk factor is basically considered two type. One is called as a contextual factor and one is basically called as a capability factor. So you can say like that contextual factor is more a internal factor. Okay, internal, or it can be external. So main difference is the degree of control the enterprise has over the respective factor. So if we take example of the internal contextual factor, it is to the large extent under the control of the enterprise, although they may not always easy to change. Example, employees and all that. But when you're talking about external contextual factors such as large extent, like outside the control of the enterprise. Example, like we migrating a data on the cloud. So we don't have a proper control over the cloud data and all that because of visibility. Second important thing is called as a capability factor. So capability factor, it is all about indicating the ability to perform the IT related activities. And these factors are critical to the successful outcome in managing a risk. Example, we have a IT related risk management capability. So we need to understand to what extent the enterprise mature in performing a risk management. The second important thing is called as a business mission. How robust or IT related capabilities support the enterprise objectives. So these are the two important factors we have that we need to analyze when we're dealing with the impact of the risk scenario. Okay. So summary is that risk event are those discrete or specific occurrence that result in an impact upon the enterprise, whereas a threat event just describe the series of action. Hacker basically trying to hack, that is a threat event, but it lead to the disclosure of a data is a risk event. Okay. So let's move to the next part. So team, we have a different way to identify the risk. Okay. Like if we did CISSP or CSAM, in which we talk about risk identification is all about identifying threats, identifying asset first. Okay. Then identify the threats, then identify the vulnerability. This is something we learn that in a risk identification step we called. Okay. In risk identification steps, we have identifying assets, we identifying threats, we identify vulnerability. Then second step is basically called as a risk analysis, where we're talking about the qualitative and quantitative way to analyze the impact. And then finally, we have a risk treatment, where we're talking about accepting of the risk, transferring, mitigating, and avoidance. But the problem is that we understood these are the steps we have in the risk identification. But what are the methods by which we identify? This is the process. Like first we identify asset, then identify threats, we identify vulnerability. That is fine in risk identification steps. But what are the methods we take in the risk identification? That's a question. So we have a three approaches that we basically use to identify the risk. So first is called as a systematic approach. It is very important for you to understand this from the exam point of view, because they might ask about advantage and disadvantage of these approaches. So systematic approach, you can say it is an expert opinion. Okay, so this is basically called as an expert opinion, in which the risk team examine and questions the business owners, business process owner, system process owner in a systematic manner to determine the potential point of failure, such as vulnerability assessment, review of business continuity, disaster recovery plan. All those things is basically part of a systematic approach. Second is basically called as a historical approach. Historical mean evidence based, such as review of historical events such as previous audit report, incident report, public media report, annual report, and press releases. Okay, so based on the past example, I joined one company and I requested last year data center security audit report, and based on that I'm trying to conclude the possible risk. Otherwise, in a systematic approach, it is more like a ongoing process, because we did the vulnerability assessment, we did the PT, and from there whatever the risk we identify we have calculated. But in the historical, we are not performing any activity based on the previous data, we taking an action. So most important thing in the historical approach is the integrity of a data. Remember this from the exam pointer perspective. If there is an inaccurate data is there which you are going to review, based on that you will going to perform the inaccurate decisions. So very important for you to understand the data. Third is basically called as a inductive method, which is more like a theoretical analysis where the team examine the process, determine the possible point of attack or compromise such as PT. So that is basically called as an inductive method. Okay, it is more like a theoretical analysis. Suppose this happened, then what is the impact? And mostly we do inductive method for a new project acquisition. So risk analysis should ensure that which method they have to use according to business sense and drive the functions. Okay, now next thing is called as a changes in a risk environment. See, risk is constantly change in the organization, that you need to understand. Okay, so we have some operational integrity. Okay, because risk analysis should ensure the new emerging risk is identified. Okay, so we need a dedicated process by which we manage that. There's a change in the industry trend. Post COVID, people are working from home, new risk is emerged. You're getting a point. So as a risk analysis, you should work with the business and system owner to perform the threat analysis and determine if and how the organization should respond to the threats. Okay, sometimes we have a forecasting risk where the previous incidents, audit reports, failures affecting both internal and external parties provide the risk analyst or practitioner with the valuable insights. So that is a pointer we have. Okay, so risk is basically changing constantly, so you can have a proper KRI and KPI by which you should able to manage the risk. Okay, one more important thing which I would like to add in the operational integrity example, we have a change management process but is not effective, and because of ineffective change management process, it lead to the new risk. Okay, we have asset management but it is not properly manageable, that lead to the new risk. Okay, change in the industry trend we have not adapted, forecasting wrong will impact the change. So these are the important parameter we have which change in the risk environment. Let's move to the next part. So now you identify different methods of identifying the risk. Okay, now we're trying to understand the possible threat. So what is threat? Threat is an action that compromises the security, which we have discussed. So we have a three type of threats here: internal threat, external threat, and emerging threats. Internal threat, like employees which may be unhappy if they are inadequately trained or treated poorly or not given enough time to do their jobs properly, that can be a biggest concern for the organization. So you will be surprised to know that anything which is external threat, manageable, emerging threat, manageable, but internal threat is a biggest concern for any risk analyst, practitioner, CISO, and all that. Okay, so it cannot be addressed by any good monitoring tools and all that until unless you have installed some kind of a behavior monitoring tool in their every laptop of the user. So it is difficult to control the internal threats. The only way to reduce the internal threat by doing a proper counseling of the employees and providing a security awareness training and explain them about why security is important, why risk is important in the organization from the management point of view. Then so disgruntled employee may intentionally compromising a system is the best example of the internal threat. Now second is basically called as a external threat. External threat can be range of threat actors. So we call it a threat actor. Threat actor, what do you mean a threat actor? So threat actor is the one who carry the threat. Okay, so we say external threat is a type, and criminal or hacktivist, okay, or a professional hacker is called as a threat actor. So they basically discover all the informations and use the information by which they try to penetrate into the internal network. So that is called as the external threats. Okay. One of the biggest concern for the risk analyst to handle the APT threats, advanced persistent threat, where the threat is exists in the organization and remain undetectable. Okay. Third is called as an emerging threat, which is an unusual activity in a system, repeated alarms, degrade systems, end of life products, or new technology you fail to understand, or cloud. So these are basically called as emerging threats, excessive network performance, excessive drops, and all that. So it is very important for you to pen down possible threats and then map with the vulnerabilities. Now question is, what are the different source of parameter we have to collect the threat information? But before that, first let's understand what is a threat modeling. See, threat modeling is all about scenario analysis of the threat, okay, that we do in the design stage of building any product or building any process. Example, like I am building a website. So after understanding a requirement of the customer, I'm trying to document the possible threat. Now customer said that I don't want to go for HTTPS. I don't want to go for a certificate because it's very expensive. So we just assuming if a user try to access this website on HTTP and he provide the username password, then during a network transit, there is a possibility someone can intercept this information. So information disclosure is possible. We only have a single server here. If server is down, everything is down. Okay, there is no logs are enabled. It is difficult to track the actions. Everyone running with the admin, so escalation of privilege is possible. So this is basically called as a threat modeling. And one of the framework we use for threat modeling is called as a stride and pasta. So we use this particular technique in a design stage of our application development, design stage of building process and all that. So that during a development, we can respect these threats, and according to that, we can address those things, because adding a security in the later stage will be more expensive. But in this condition, we're trying to understand the different way to collect the threat information. So first most effective technique is called as a conducting interviews. So you can prepare the questionnaires and provide them to the interviewee in advance so they can bring any supporting documentation, report, or data that may be necessary. But one important detail to be obtained during an interview is the level of impact that previous incident have had on the enterprise, including the incidents, how the incident was handled, the result of post-incident review, root cause analysis, and all that. So as a risk analyst, you should be aware that people made available for interview may not be the correct people to answer the risk related questions. So understand the audience first. Example I can give you, when I was doing an audit of the change management process, I tried to understand from one of the team member is that how one change will impact the overall organization production. So this kind of incident will give the idea, in the change management process, people are not reviewing the change request properly. SIA was not mentioned properly. Security impact analysis, there is no rollback plan was mentioned. So this kind of interview sessions will give the more visibility about the possible threats. Then media reports are there, like newspaper, television, article, social media can be useful source of information about the threats or incident. Third is called as observation. Writing it does not mean happens. Listening it does not mean happens. Go look and verify. So watching a processes as an independent observer may highlight issues that are unable to seen as clearly by those performing the operation, and can help to identify a situation in which document process are not been followed or where the process are found to be lacking. One example I can give you about the observation is that, I myself perform end-to-end change management requests to check whether they're following the process or not. Example that what I did, I request one change and saw and try to observe how much time it will take to open the change request or work on the change request, because as per the process document, it is mentioned that it will take 2 working days to respond to the change request. So I have waited for 2 working days. Then I have seen they have approved my change request without doing SIA, without notifying me. They are not doing any kind of a testing, they are updating. So this kind of an observation give the better visibility, because in the interview, they will tell you only about their records. They will only tell you good thing about their process. By observing this activity, you can do that. In one of the interview where I was documenting a possible threats and all that, the person saying that we are following separation duty. I myself perform end-to-end one activity in the application. I can see that as a one user, I'm able to create a bill, delete a bill, and managing a bill. So it's a failure of separation duty. In one cases, they said, okay, we are compliance with 8-character password. I myself create a username password with a less than 8 character. And I was able to create successfully. It means it is not compliance with the policy. So writing it does not mean happens. Go look and verify. Okay. Next thing is basically called as a logs. Logs is the another important pointer we have that we need to work on this. And you can say that you can say like that logs are the powerful source of threats. These logs, when ingested in security information event management tool, it can be used in correlating even from a different source to identify threats or the incidents. Okay, I can see the pattern of multiple IPs coming from outside and doing an access of my website. So you can see that it's kind of a DOS attack. Sometimes we can trust the third-party reports like SOC 2 report, ISO report, process report, and all that. So that is also one of the best way to collect the threats informations. And sometimes we have a user feedback also where the system user are in an excellent position to know the system and its shortcoming, including the potential vulnerability. So interacting with the user and learning their issues and concerns regarding the system may indicate where the security controls could be circumvented for their convenience or improve the efficiencies. And last is sometimes vendor reports are there. There are many sources of information on the current threats and vulnerability, and new type of malwares or emerging attack methods are there. Sometimes Checkpoint, Palo Alto, they publish a lot of reports about the products and all that. So these are the source of informations we have that we can use for identifying the threats. So sometimes what happens, we basically create some scenario analysis of possible threats in the project. So we have a misuse or abuse case modeling. So when I say misuse case is like looks at a variety of possible errors, mistakes. One example I can say about misuse is we also have a use case threat. Okay, use case threat. Example like we have a application. Okay, so it accept username 8-character and password 8-character. So I enter the 8-character username, 8-character password with this expectation that okay, it will process without any error. That is called as a use case. But misuse case is that I will try to enter the 9-character username and 9-character password. And my expectation is that if I intentionally or unintentionally adding a 9-character, it should produce the error that invalid value. But what happens is it accept and process the information. It lead to some kind of a home page or configuration page which reveal a lot of details. So I perform the misuse case testing to see how it reacts. Okay. We also have misuse case advanced version is called as an abuse case, where I'm abusing more and more security issues like buffer overflow. Because in misuse case, I went again with a negative value, but my intention is not to hack. My intention is enter some negative, unintentional value and see how it going to react. Sometime a teacher basically asked out of syllabus question. Objective is not to exploit, but just to see if this kind of a thing come, what is the answer. But when we going for the abuse case, it is more like a security issues. Okay, where we examine the security, privacy, interaction of a system, user, data, stakeholder. So abuse case consider the complete interaction between the system like a threat attacker. Okay, where the result of interactions are harmful to the systems, like pen testing is an example of abuse case modeling. Okay, so that is the thing we have. So understanding misuse and abuse case helps to ensure the system is designed and built with the resiliency and has the ability to handle the errors, misuse and abuse cases. Okay. So next thing is called as threat modeling. So threat modeling is all about scenario analysis of a threat. So it helps the risk practitioner, analyst, designer, developer, operator to build a system with attention to defensive control, built-in security feature and proper placement with the strategy of overlapping defense. Because if we don't have a threat modeling, we will not analyze the threat perspective and we just develop the application in a one go. And later on when we develop the application, okay, then hacker hack into that. Again, we need to roll back. Again, we need to spend time. So it's better after having a meeting with the stakeholder and understanding their functional requirement, we design the entire application. And in that, when we design, the first thing what we do the data flow diagram analysis. Let me show you an example. Now, if you notice, This is basically called as a threat modeling exercise. The first step here, you can see define the security requirement. I had a meeting with the stakeholder. I understand what is a security need, what is a non-security requirement need in the application. Then we create an application diagram, how the data going to be flow and all that. Creating an application diagram is also called as a DFD, data flow diagram. How the user is interacting with the server, how server is providing things. We just assuming this, we haven't developed yet, we just design this, and then in that we identifying threats, mitigating threat. Okay, I understood, we have a HTTP, we should use HTTPS. I can see after authentication there is no OTP, so someone can hack into account directly, he can or she can able to access the account portal. So we mitigating those threats, we validating those threats, and then use this information in a development. And during a development we give those attentions. Okay, so during a development or doing a coding and all that, we respect those issues, and according to that we try to develop the things, and then we validate those threats. So this is basically called as a threat modeling. So it is basically from Microsoft, you can see it is clearly said. So by threat modeling, it enables the developer or software architect to communicate about the security design, analyze those design, and suggest. So it is not necessary the threat modeling we performed on the identify threat. No, we just doing our analysis. We just assuming, as I said, we just assuming that this kind of a thing happen. So if happen, what is the impact? So during a development stage, we give attention to that. So risk analyst or risk practitioner must think of as many of these methods approach as possible, so that adequate controls can be designed to meet the possible threats. Okay. So this is the thing we have in a threat modeling and threat landscape. Now, after documenting a possible threats, we need to identify the vulnerability. So vulnerability is a weakness in the system. Vulnerabilities are the weakness, gaps, or holes in the enterprise people, process, and technology that provide an opportunity for the threat actor to exploit, which create a consequences that may impact the enterprise. So we have a different sources of vulnerability. So first is called as a network vulnerability, like someone is hijacking the network sessions and all that. Okay, they are using a plain text, or hacker gain access to the network. From there, he gain access to the internal network. So that is a network vulnerability, like unpatched router, unpatched switch is open with dynamic port. So that is basically called as a network vulnerability. Second is called as a physical access. Someone is physically access to the facility by using a fake card. There's no security guard. So that is called as a physical access vulnerability. Supply chain, we onboard one vendor. Okay, he provide or she provide me the application which is come with that malware, trojans and all that. Okay, and that invite new attack to the organization. So that is called a supply chain vulnerability. We are using some equipment which has not been patched, or we use some equipment which already achieve its end of life product. So it can be a soft target for the hackers. Example, I bought one router or switch, it already completed its lifespan, or the vendor stopped giving us support for the new security updates, and still we are using that. So hacker can exploit that easily because there's no patches available from the vendor, right? So this is the thing. The biggest concern we have is the cloud computing. Okay, cloud is a shift from capex to opex. Definitely cloud save lot of time. Cloud computing is just like a Uber. You book the cab, it will pick you from your location, drop you to the location, and it will only charge for what you use. You don't need to pay for insurance. You don't need to pay for fuel and all that. You just need to pay for what you use. Same cloud we have. Okay, I have subscribed for a 1 month subscription for my Zoom meeting. I use it, and next month I will withdraw. See, in the cloud computing, one thing is that you can transfer the compliance to you can transfer the operation to third party, but you cannot transfer the compliance. Example, like I am a data subject. Okay, I went to bank. Okay, so I went to bank. Now bank is basically using a cloud service which is called AWS, in which they host the application. So data subject came to open an account in the bank. They collect all the information and they feed the information in the application. So that application store in the cloud. Tomorrow any security breach happen in the AWS, bank is the one who answerable to data subject. Bank is the one who answerable to the regulatory authority. So no matter you transfer the entire operation in the cloud, you still accountable for the compliance and all that. Tomorrow the bank face the regulatory audit, ISO audit. They cannot say that now this portion of IT moved to cloud, so please remove this from the scope. Not at all. you can request those documentation from AWS to meet your compliance requirement. So in cloud computing, we have a several vulnerabilities. Like we have a limited visibility. That is the one thing we have. Cloud is giving me power to create the service and all that, but too much self-service can lead to the unauthorized use and abuse. And it has happened in the past when new cloud service was introduced in India and giving an on-demand self-service feature to the customer. Unnecessary, they're creating a machines and it is basically used in their infrastructure, and unnecessary it generating a billing for the company. Sometimes the API that is used for the integration, it is not working properly. So that basically compromise. And sometimes there is no proper segregation of the machines we have. So if you're talking about the on-prem data center, on-prem server, everything is basically controlled by you. You can have a separate server for separate data. But in the cloud, there is a multi-tenant is there where your data will be shared with other tenant until unless you go for the private cloud or third-party reports and all that. So these are the several risks we have in the cloud computing. So one suggestion is that any question talking about data security in the cloud, answer is encryption. Contract is also not effective, to be frank, because if you can discontinue service, contract is also discontinue. Okay, so you simply delete the data. It doesn't mean the data is successfully deleted from the cloud. So it's better encrypt the data, store the data in the cloud, and directly delete the encrypted state of data from the cloud itself. Because tomorrow, if employer can able to recover the data, still they need a key to decrypt the data. So this kind of a vulnerabilities we have. Then we have a big data. Big data mean data processing. So biggest concern is the integrity of a data. Make sure you're processing the right data. So we sometimes inaccurate data processing lead to the inaccurate data decisions. So you have to be very careful with several risks which is associated with the big data. Example like amplified technical impact. So if unauthorized user were to gain access to the centralized repository, it put the entity or entirety of those data in a compromise rather than subset of the data. Second is collecting a data. Okay, it's lead to the privacy breach. So analytics techniques can impact the privacy also, right? Example, I am collecting the information of a one particular location, like what is a purchase habit of the consumer, what kind of a brand they buy, what kind of a drink they consume. So somehow it is indirectly collecting the data from a PI impact perspective. Okay. So sometime when we aggregating the information from multiple source, it lead to the privacy breach. So these are some of the concerns we have that we need to understand. These are the vulnerabilities we have in the big data. Okay. So once we identify this vulnerability, we do the gap analysis. Okay. Gap analysis mean, suppose this is what this is the state we have. Okay. So this is what we have right now and this is what we need to achieve. So the gap between that need to be addressed through the controls. Okay. So by documenting the desired state or condition of risk that management want to reach, and then carefully analyzing and evaluating the current condition of the organization, the risk analysts identify the existence of a risk gap and the scope of action that may need it to close the gap. And gap analysis can be used in an interaction to devise the deliverables, projects and milestone. Okay, so that is the thing we have. So one example I can give you about gap analysis is suppose we have a exploitable vulnerability. So we have exploitable vulnerability is discovered on a new application. Okay. So we have a application here. Let me delete that. So this is the application we have. Okay. So we have discovered the vulnerability in this application and it's an exploitable vulnerability. So exploitable vulnerability discovered on the application, and this application basically store the sensitive data. Okay. So exploitable vulnerability has been discovered on a newly application that allowed for a sensitive data to be accessed without authorization. So that is basically my current state. Okay. It means hacker can able to exploit and gain access to the data. That is my current state. Hacker able to gain access to data. So this is basically my current state. Okay, and this basically violate the data privacy requirement which is established by organization. So that is my desired state. Okay, my desired state is what? Exploiting the privacy policy. So what I need and what we have, that is a gap. Okay, so this is the risk which exceed the defined risk appetite. So project to implement the necessary technical control is approved to prevent the vulnerability from this exploitation. Clear team? My risk appetite is the privacy policy to be comply, and this is something what I discovered, or this is something which I discovered. So I have applied the control to fill this gap. So that is why we have a gap analysis. So in this scenario, we also having a vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. Okay, before that, so application of those control reduce the risk to an acceptable level, and the vulnerability is no longer accepted. So this is how we reduce the gap. Okay, so using the gap analysis method, to plan the projects along with the milestones, which helps the organization to initiate and execute the project in a orderly and logical manner. So what is VNPT? Vulnerability assessment is all about identifying the vulnerability. Okay, it is all about identifying the vulnerability. But penetration testing is the next level where we exploit the vulnerability and gain access to the system. So we have a system A, we discover the weak password in the system. That is basically a VA. But exploiting this vulnerability and gain access to system is basically called as a PT. Okay. Sometimes we have approval of VA, but we don't have approval of PT. Never do that, because PT will directly impact the availability of the system. Clear team? So we have to be very careful. So when you're involved in the VAPT, we have to check the false positive also. False positive is basically mean not true. Okay. And we also need to check if we can able to exploit the 0-day attacks. Okay. So virus infected a file, but in reality it is not, it is a false positive. We need to validate also. Okay. So whatever the results we have, on which we do the root cause analysis. Okay. Which is a diagnosis to establish the origin of events, the lesson that can be learned from the consequences and all that. And then the action that enterprise take in response to a risk are often based on the lesson learned from the previous event only. Okay, so as a prudent risk analysis, examine the root cause of an incident to discover the conditions and factor that led to the event rather than reacting to the symptoms of the problem. So action the enterprise take in response to a risk are often based on the lesson learned from the previous event. Okay, so we discover the open port. In the past, we have discovered that, okay, with the same open port, they gain access to the system. So that was the root cause analysis. Based on that, I can prepare the action plan and I will patch that particular port. So question is now how to create a risk scenario. So what is risk scenario first? So we get the information about asset, we get the information about threat, we got the information about vulnerability. Now I will accumulate this information and create a risk scenario. So risk scenario is a tangible and accessible representation of a risk. Risk scenario is a description of a possible threat event whose occurrence will have a certain impact or uncertain impact on the achievement of enterprise objective, which can be positive or negative. I repeat again, hacker is going to exploit the vulnerability through which they gain access to the system. So this is the entire risk scenario we have. Okay. So we have a two type of risk scenario development. One is called top-down approach and one is called bottom-up. We will see how this basically risk impact the business goal. Okay, with this new project, it impact the business objective. So this is basically called as a top-down risk scenario development, where we understanding the business goal and see how the risk event impact those goals. Starting a new training will impact my existing goal. So this is basically my top-down approach. But bottom-up approach describing a risk event which is specific to the individual enterprise situation, like cyber attacks and vulnerability. Like if this vulnerability is basically there, attacker can going to exploit this vulnerability. It lead to the system disclosure. So that is called as a bottom-up. I repeat again, with the new project, what is the risk impact? That is a top-down. Like, shall we go for this project? Shall we go for this project? Shall we go for this new initiatives? That is a top-down approach. But bottom-up approach is basically mean we have a server which support the critical business function. Okay, if server is down, it has a huge impact. So one operation thing will impact the entire business. So that is called as a bottom-up. Okay. So we need to develop the information technology risk scenario, which is a description of the event that can lead to the business impact. And sometimes this type of activity is also called as a BIA. Okay. So that is the thing we have. So we need to analyze this risk scenario. So we use two methods here. One is basically called as a FAIR model. FAIR is basically stand for factor analysis of information risk. which decompose the major component that comprise a risk into smaller manageable component that all of the analysis has to be performed. And second is basically called as a harm model. Harm model stand for holistic approach to risk management. Okay, so it is a entire methodology that built on the open fair model, which is similar in the nature, but account for loss magnitude are discrete level. Okay, so both fair and harm leverage Monte Carlo engine that allow the number of simulation to be performed for qualitative and quantitative. So if you ask me, fair is the most effective one we have. So this is on the first part. Let's move to the part B, which is called as a IT risk analysis, evaluation and assessment. Now at this particular stage, what we did is we identified the threats, scenarios and everything. Now we're going to calculate the impact. Okay, we need to calculate the impact, because after the risk is identified and documented in the risk register, the next step is the risk management life cycle is to assess the IT risk level. And risk management is a process of identify, evaluate risk and its potential impact, which is include the evaluation of a critical function which is necessary for the enterprise to continue business operation. We also need to see the risk associated with each of the critical functions. We need to see the control in place, prioritize the risk on a base of likelihood and impact. We discovered the 17 risks in the organization by identifying threats, vulnerability. But now we need to prioritize risk based on the impact, because every risk cannot be addressed with the same level of control. So we need to prioritize, we need to see the relationship between the risk and enterprise risk appetite, and make sure whatever the action we are taking, it should be taken in a cost effective manner, because risk assessment process generate the information which is used to respond to risk in an appropriate cost effective manner. So that is the point we have. So we have to do the risk ranking, okay, which is basically has a high impact, which is has basically a low impact. So that is called as a risk ranking. And we also need to establish the risk ownership and accountability, because each risk must be linked to the individual who own the risk according to their job responsibility and duty. That is why in every organization we follow the RACI chart. Okay, we follow the RACI chart. So risk owner is basically having a task with the who is responsible for making a decision. So as when you're preparing for series, you need to have a clear visibility about what is risk owner, what is risk analyst, who is a risk appetite, risk professional, practitioner, and risk manager. So you need to have that clarity. I'm not going to cover that, okay, because it is difficult for me to cover in the entire session. But if you're preparing for series, you need to have a clarity about the risk owner. For your information, risk owner is nothing. It's a data owner, business owner who own the business. Okay. So it is very important, whatever the risk calculated we had, whatever the impact we have, it need to be linked with the ownership. So someone should take the ownership of that, right? Like during an audit, we discover any finding. So there should be someone owner who will responsible for close those findings, right? So with whom we can do the follow up. So risk owner is a task with a responsible for making the decision of what the best response is to identify risk, and must be at the level in the enterprise where there is authorized to make a decision on behalf of enterprise or can be accountable for the decision. We also maintain different type of documentation. So we have some risk related documentations also. Example like indicate any gaps between the current risk environment and desired state. Okay. Risk assessment documentation provides some basis on which we can judge the severity of the identified issues and severity of the issues. Risk assessment report should document the process which use as well as a result of a risk assessment, and each risk should be documented in a manner that is understandable to the management. Okay, make sure the risk report, whatever you're creating, okay, it should be with the audience mind, and we need to communicate the result of the risk assessment to the relevant stakeholders. Sometimes what happen, we have to address the risk exclusion. Example like we have a policy which say that we cannot send plain text data, but now regulatory authority want data in the plain text. So we assess the risk of non-compliance, flag for risk exclusion, and we send the data in a plain text to the regulatory authority. So sometimes we have a risk exclusion. So when an assumption is made to not include a particular risk in assessment, risk analysis may find it's beneficial to document that risk was intentionally excluded rather than missed in the risk assessment process. And we need to provide the justification and rationale behind the exclusion. It is very important document, because tomorrow that risk value exceed the capacity. Right now it is under the appetite, so we have accepted or we have removed. But tomorrow, if that risk exceed my capacity and all that, it's a concern. So risk analysis will re-evaluate each documented risk to ensure it was identified, assessed, and accurately based on the current risk landscape. And as a deeper level of investigations and evaluation of risk which is conducted, new type of risk may surface while other may be previously excluded or found to be relevant. So it's very important, document all the exclusions. So we have a different way to conduct the risk analysis. Okay. Quantitative risk analysis, qualitative and semi-quantitative, which is a hybrid model. So risk register is a one document that contains all the risk that has been detected by the various parts and activity of the enterprise, which include the risk identified in the audit, vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, incident reports, the process reviews, and all that. Okay. So risk register is a very important thing, which talk about outstanding risk issues, status of risk mitigation efforts, and emergence of a new identified and documented risk. So when we're talking about the risk analysis, one is called as a quantitative, where we map impact with some dollar value. Example, if server is basically down, let me write down here. So we have a server here. Okay. If there is a virus which basically exploit this vulnerability, the server is basically down. The cost of the downtime is $40,000. So this is basically called as a quantitative risk assessment, where we calculate the impact based on the monetary value. Okay. Dollar figure is a universal currency we use. Second is basically called as a qualitative risk assessment. But one thing is that with the quantitative risk assessment, it is not a fast method. To perform the quantitative risk assessment, we need every piece of data related to the business. Okay, more accuracy is required, more experience is required. It is not a faster way to calculate. Okay, if you're looking for the faster way to calculate, then we can go for a qualitative risk assessment. In qualitative risk assessment, I can say, okay, this topic is important, this topic is important, this topic is important. But in the quantitative, I'm saying this topic is important because 20 question is expected from the domain 1. But in the qualitative, we just say high risk, low risk, and medium risk. So we set the benchmark that anything is a regulatory impact is a high risk, anything is a operation is a medium risk. So your internal audit, your ISO audits, all are basically qualitative risk assessment only, where the impact is basically mapped with the high, low, and medium. Third is basically called as a semi-quantitative, where we basically use numbers with the qualitative value. Example, anything which exceeds the $40,000, it is considered as a medium risk. So number map with high, low, and medium. So these are the different type of analysis method we have that we basically follow. Next thing is basically called as a business impact analysis. See, BIA and risk assessment are often talked about the same time. And that is because many enterprises perform these two activity in close coordination with one another. Okay. However, there is a key distinction between the BIA and risk assessment we have. So BIA, if I talk about BIA, okay. So if you talk about the BIA, so BIA, what it does, it is used to establish the requirement for business continuity. Okay, it is used to establish the requirement for business continuity effort, which including the identifying resources dependency, tracing those requirements to impact, justifying the investments that are associated with the disruption of services. Like, what is critical, what is not. But when you're talking about the risk assessment basically focus on understanding a threat faced by the enterprise, like likelihood, impact, okay, associated with those threats to properly respond to the risk with the goal of decreasing the likelihood or impact the organization could experience. Somehow you can say like the BIA include the risk assessment. Example, like I assess the risk of a server. Okay. I identify server is basically down for 2 hours. Okay, server is down for 2 hours. So that is something we have accepted as a MTD. If I fail to achieve or restore the server in 2 hours, then what is the impact? So there we involve the risk assessment. Okay, so this is how the BIA risk assessment is basically used together. Okay, so that is the point we have. So BIA basically help me to prioritize what need to be recovered and how quickly I can recover. Okay, and BIA basically help me to understand what kind of a recovery strategy we need. Okay, we need a hot side, we need a cold side. So BIA is basically input for the recovery strategy. And based on the recovery strategy, we create a DR plan. that okay, in the case of disaster we need to restore this server first or that server first. Okay, so that is the point we have. If you see my BCP BIA video, you can get a understanding of that function. Okay, what is BI BCP? Then once we're done with all the analysis, we need to map this risk with the inherent, residual and current risk. Okay, so inherent is a first risk. Inherent mean the risk state without any action taken. Without any action. Okay, that exists without considering the action the management has taken or might take to mitigate the risk. So inherent risk is present because the nature of situation, for example, out of the box, the state of risk before any process or technologies or the control are put in place. Example like people are working from home, it's a default inherent risk. So many transactions are there, it is difficult to audit each and every transaction. That is an inherent risk. Okay, cloud has some inherent risk. We don't have an end-to-end control of the physical area. So that is called as an inherent risk. Then we identify the current risk, which is point in time. Point in time. So point in time basically describe the current. Now example like we know that in cloud we have a limited visibility. And with that limited visibility, we want to proceed with the cloud. So that is an inherent risk. Okay, now when we onboard the cloud, we will try to see what is actual risk. Okay, what is actual risk? Okay, so current risk represent the inherent risk with the enterprise risk response applied. So when risk is referred, okay, it is definitely as a current risk. Okay, so where the risk associated with the asset, the risk state that exists, which take into account those actions that have already been taken, but not actions are anticipated. Okay, so that is basically called as a current risk. Now we understood visibility is the issue. So we sign the contract, we sign the audit reports. Okay, we sign the SLAs with the cloud provider in which we get a cloud reports and all that. So by this way, I can able to reduce the risk. So risk which is left after implementing control is a residual risk. So summary is that not signing the SLA contract is an inherent risk. Signing the SLA contract with the cloud after engage them, that is a residual risk. So risk before treatment is inherent, risk after treatment is a residual risk. So this is all from my side on the domain 2. Do let me know your feedback about this video, and do let me know, shall I make the domain 3 video and how you find the session useful, what are the new videos you want me to make, and do subscribe to my channel because I am coming up with more informative videos on the same content. Thank you for watching my video. Good day.